The day we signed the divorce papers, Caleb Sterling tossed a card at me. Take the money. We're even now. He thought he was finally rid of me. The Jinx who'd cursed his life, so he could go marry his destined soulmate. What he didn't know was the second half of the mystic's prophecy, the part he never got to finish. If you leave her, you won't live a year. Now 3 months have passed. He's racked with pain, coughing up blood, kneeling outside the new herbalist clinic I opened, begging me to save his life. And I just calmly grind my herbs, not even looking up. Mr. Sterling, we're even. Whether you live or die, what's that got to do with me? The rain was coming down hard. It hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows, sounding like it wanted to smash right through this ridiculously expensive villa. I, Clara Thorne, sat on the Italian leather sofa in the living room, holding a cup of herbal tea that had long gone cold. My fingertips were numb, but my heart felt like it was slowly roasting over a low flame. The European-style clock on the wall chimed 10 o'clock. A familiar set of footsteps echoed from the entryway, steady, but with a hint of urgency he couldn't quite hide. I knew he was home. Caleb Sterling, my husband. Or I suppose my soon-to-be ex-husband. He shrugged off his rain-soaked coat, and the housekeeper rushed to take it. He didn't even glance in my direction, walking straight across the room to sit opposite me. Those deep-set eyes I once drowned in now felt like shards of ice, stabbing right at me. She's back, he said, his voice flat. But the words were like a dull knife sawing at my already numb nerves. My fingers, wrapped around the teacup, tightened almost imperceptibly. The cold from the porcelain seeped through my skin and into my bones. I knew who she was. Sophia, the woman who had lived in his heart for years, the one he'd idolized. Oh, I heard myself say. The sound was a single, dull note. I couldn't even be bothered to feign a question. This 5-year marriage had worn away every last spark I had. A document slid across the coffee table toward me. The bright white of the paper hurt my eyes. The bold, black letters at the top felt like a searing brand. Divorce papers. Sign it, Caleb ordered, his tone like he was telling his assistant to file some trivial document. Sophia has the crimson birthmark on her wrist now. My head snapped up, and my gaze crashed into his cold one. The crimson birthmark. That damn crimson birthmark again. 5 years ago, that old mystic who could supposedly see the future pointed a bloody finger at me in the Sterling family estate, right in front of Caleb and his grandfather. He'd coughed up blood, barely getting the words out. This woman is your. What came next? No one knows. The old man couldn't catch his breath and died on the spot. But because of that half-finished prophecy, because I happened to be there, and because I happened to have a small red mark on my wrist which later turned out to be just an allergic reaction, Caleb, a man who firmly believed you can't fight fate, married me. He married me, a substitute who, in his eyes, just barely fit the signs. For 5 years, I've held the empty title of Mrs. Sterling, guarding this house that was as cold as a tomb. He gave me a life of luxury but was too stingy to offer even a single tender glance. Everyone on the outside said I, Clara Thorne, had won the lottery, that I'd married up. Only I knew that for the last 5 years, I'd been living like a decorative good luck charm for the house, and not a very welcome one at that. Now the real one was back. The legendary crimson birthmark, the one that proved the identity of his destined soulmate, had appeared on Sophia's wrist. So it was time for me, the counterfeit, to know my place and get out. Something squeezed my heart, hard. The pain was so sharp I almost doubled over. But I knew I couldn't, not at this final moment. The only thing I had left was this pathetic scrap of self-respect. Caleb, I heard my voice waver, but I fought to keep it steady. What was I to you for these 5 years? His eyes held not a shred of guilt, only a kind of cruel frankness. Clara, you and I both know the truth. These 5 years were nothing more than a transaction. You enjoyed 5 years of wealth and status as Mrs. Sterling, and now the person who truly deserves this position is back. He paused, his tone dripping with condescending charity. Don't worry, you'll get a generous settlement. It'll be enough to keep you comfortable for the rest of your life. Transaction, settlement, comfortable for the rest of your life. The words pierced my ears like icicles. 5 years of my life, 5 years of treading carefully, 5 years of nursing a tiny, humble flicker of hope. In his eyes, it was all just a transaction with a clear price tag. I looked at him, at the face I had loved for 5 years, and that had brought me 5 years of pain. Perfectly chiseled, impossibly handsome, and as cold as a statue. I suddenly found it all laughable. I was laughing at myself, and at him. "Caleb," I said softly, my voice laced with a weariness that was foreign even to me. "Do you really believe what that psychic said? Do you really believe in some crimson birthmark?" "You can't fight fate," he answered, his tone absolute, as if stating a universal truth. "The Master's prophecies have never been wrong. I was blind before and let you take Sophia's place for 5 years. It's time for things to be set right." Set right. What a way to put it. So what were my 5 years? A mistaken interlude? A temporary stand-in? An immense wave of helplessness and absurdity washed over me. All the grievances, the bitterness, and the anger strangely settled, hardening into a dead, icy calm. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my hands from shaking. My eyes scanned the divorce papers. The number listed under asset division was indeed impressive. Caleb had always been generous with money, especially when he was getting rid of someone. Fine. I picked up the cold tea and drank it all in one go. The icy liquid slid down my throat, chilling me all the way to my stomach, but it strangely cleared my chaotic mind. I picked up the pen and uncapped it. The nib hovered over the signature line for a moment. Caleb just watched, his expression unmoving, as if waiting for a predetermined process to complete. I suddenly remembered our wedding day. It was a rainy day too. He held the umbrella while I held his arm. I remember thinking, even if we're getting married for such a ridiculous reason, if I just try hard enough, maybe one day I can warm his stone-cold heart. Looking back now, it was so naive it was comical. You can't warm a stone. It will only cut your hands until they bleed. No more hesitation. I lowered my head and stroke by stroke, on that stark white paper, I signed my name, Clara Thorne. The signature was a bit messy but perfectly clear. I put the pen down, pushed the papers away, and stood up. I moved with a crispness that surprised even me. "Just wire the money to my account," I said, my voice as calm as a placid lake. "Caleb, from now on we're even." Without another glance at him, I turned and walked upstairs. I didn't have many things, most of them were bought by him. I packed one small suitcase with a few casual outfits I'd bought myself, some essential documents, and an old photograph of my mother that I had hidden away. As I passed through the living room, Caleb was still sitting there, his back to me, staring out at the rain. The light traced the hard, cold outline of his profile. He probably thought I would cry, scream, or have a hysterical fit, begging him to stay. Too bad. I was done with all that. When the heart dies, the tears dry up. I walked to the front door, pulling my suitcase. The housekeeper stood nearby, a complicated look in her eyes. I opened the door, and the wind and rain immediately rushed in, carrying the damp, earthy smell of the storm. "Ma'am," the housekeeper started, as if she wanted to say something. I gave her a faint smile, shook my head, and then, without a second thought, stepped out into the cold, driving rain. Behind me was the brightly lit cage that had never offered me a single shred of warmth. Ahead of me was an endless storm and an unknown future. The rain instantly soaked my hair and clothes, chilling me to the bone. But I felt like the massive weight that had been crushing my chest for 5 years had suddenly cracked open under the downpour. A tangled mix of pain, humiliation, and a faint sense of release sprouted like a wild vine inside me. "Caleb, you believe in fate, don't you? Well, you'd better pray that the end of the old mystic sentence, 'This woman is your,' wasn't some curse you'll live to regret. Because from the moment you let me walk out this door, your fate, my destiny. Who's to say how they'll turn out now?" The wheels of my suitcase made a monotonous noise on the wet pavement, quickly swallowed by the roar of the rain. I lifted my head, letting the rain wash over my face. This rain is really coming down. Hard enough, maybe, to wash away the last 5 years. And hard enough, perhaps, to signal that some people's good days are about to come to an end. As for me, Clara Thorne, whether I live or die, thrive or fail, from now on, that's my business and mine alone. Fine. I'd get out. If there's one thing I, Clara Thorne, have, it's a strong backbone. If I could grit my teeth and survive 5 years in the stagnant water of the Sterling family, I could take that settlement money and claw my way back out of the mud. The day after signing the papers, I moved into an old street on the south side. The apartment I rented was small and smelled of damp wood, but the windows faced south, letting sunlight pour in, unobstructed and dazzlingly bright. This place was a world away from the cold palace the Sterlings had built with money and indifference. I used a tiny fraction of Caleb's settlement to buy out a failing traditional Chinese medicine shop at the end of the alley. I didn't even change the sign. It was still the old, paint chip the herbalist, a bit common, but it had an authentic down-to-earth feel. At first, the neighbors all gave me curious looks. What was a young, striking woman like me doing messing around with this half-dead apothecary? I didn't bother explaining. I just spent my days in a faded cotton dress, sitting behind the counter, either reading the ancient, thread-bound books I'd nearly worn out or slowly wiping down the dusty drawers of the medicine cabinets. Life suddenly slowed down, so much so that I could almost hear the sound of sunlight crawling across the dust motes. Occasionally, bits of news would drift my way like autumn leaves, landing unexpectedly in my little world. For example, Sterling Corp's big overseas green energy project, the one that was supposed to be a sure thing, had fallen through. Apparently, their partner had suddenly backed out, and the massive initial investment went right down the drain. And then there was the news that Caleb had fainted without warning at a major signing ceremony, and was rushed to the hospital. They ran every test imaginable, but the results all came back normal. Yet he was too weak to get out of bed, spending his days in a listless haze. The news came from an old housekeeper from the Sterling estate who had always been kind to me. She called me in secret. Her voice was full of concern. "His illness is so strange, sir. The hospital can't find anything wrong, but you can just see him wasting away, ma'am. Do you think this could be?" She didn't dare finish the sentence. But I understood. The prophecy, it was starting to come true. I stood in front of the medicine cabinets, holding the phone long after she'd hung up. My fingers traced the brass handles, each labeled with the name of an herb. Angelica, astragalus, buplurum. The metal was cool to the touch. I couldn't quite describe the feeling in my heart. It was a little tight, a little sour, like I'd swallowed an unripe plum. It wasn't pity. That ridiculous scrap of affection I'd had for him was completely exhausted the moment he threw those divorce papers in my face. It was just the dazed feeling of seeing the inevitable finally happen. "Look, Caleb. The fate you hold so sacred has arrived. It's just that the blade seems to be swinging in a direction you didn't quite expect." I didn't try to find out more about his condition. From the moment I signed my name, his life and death had nothing to do with Clara Thorne. I kept to my little shop, occasionally treating the old neighbors for headaches and colds, prescribing cheap and effective remedies. Life was simple, but it had a grounded sense of peace. Until one afternoon, a black Maybach, completely out of place in this dilapidated old alley, screeched to a halt in front of the herbalist like a predator cornering a flock of sheep. The door opened and Caleb's executive assistant, a man named Davis, got out first. He was always in a perfectly tailored suit, his expression impeccably managed. But right now, that usual calm had cracked, replaced by visible anxiety. He strode in, his eyes quickly scanning the small but tidy shop before landing on me. His expression was one of undisguised shock and a hint of disbelieving scrutiny. Miss Thorne, he corrected himself, though his tone still carried the ingrained habit of looking down on me. "Mr. Sterling is gravely ill. We need your help." I was weighing herbs on a small scale and didn't even look up. "You're in the wrong place, Davis. The hospital is 2 blocks down on your left." Davis's face stiffened. He clearly hadn't expected this reaction. He forced himself to be patient. "Miss Thorne, Mr. Sterling's condition is critical. We've had specialists from all over the world look at him, but no one can find the cause. Someone recommended this Mr. Thorne, and they said only he can cure him. We traced Mr. Thorne's address here." He deliberately emphasized Mr. Thorne. Only then did I slowly put down the scale, dust the herb powder from my hands, and look up at him. Sunlight slanted in from the doorway, casting a small, bright patch on his polished leather shoes. "Oh, Mr. Thorne," I said, a humorless smile touching my lips. "That would be me." The expression on Davis's face was suddenly a spectacular mess, like an overturned paint palette. Shock, doubt, and absurdity all morphed into the frantic impatience of someone desperate for a solution. Miss Thorne, this is no time for jokes. Mr. Sterling is. Do I look like I'm joking? I cut him off, walking to the counter and picking up a yellowed medical text, flipping through it slowly. I am the Mr. Thorne you're looking for. But I'm not making house calls these days. Especially not for, I paused, my gaze sweeping past him, as if it could pierce through the car door and see the weak, broken man inside. Strangers. Clara Thorne. Davis finally lost his composure, his voice laced with a threat. If anything happens to Mr. Sterling, do you really think you can walk away blameless? Don't forget, you two just got divorced. So. I slammed the book shut with a soft thump and looked at him, my eyes turning cold. Does the law state that an ex-wife is responsible for her ex-husband's life and death? Or is it just a habit in the Sterling family to expect divorced women to come running whenever they're called? I took 2 steps forward until I was standing right in front of him. I was shorter than him, but somehow my presence seemed to overpower him. Davis, if you're asking for a favor, you should act like it, I said, enunciating each word clearly. Go back and tell Caleb Sterling that if he wants to live, he can come here himself. As for whether I'll treat him, and how, that depends on my mood. Davis was so choked by my words that his face turned purple. His chest heaved as if he'd never been so humiliated. He glared at me for a long moment, then finally clenched his jaw, turned on his heel, and strode back to the Maybach, yanking the door open and diving inside. The car didn't leave right away. It just sat there, growling like a cornered animal that refused to admit defeat. I sat back down behind the counter and picked up the medical book, but I couldn't read a single word. The sun outside was still bright, warming my hands. But I knew that the wheel of fate, which Caleb himself had set in motion, was now spinning wildly. He thought that by getting rid of me, the fake, he would be welcoming the real one, and an even more brilliant life. Little did he know, he had personally slammed shut the only door that might have led to his survival. And now the key to that door was in my hand. I looked down at my own hands, no longer meticulously manicured, now stained with a bit of herbal dust. Caleb, the fate you worship has delivered its first slap to your face. Does it hurt? Don't worry. This is just the beginning. The rain was still falling, a relentless drizzle that seemed determined to wash away all the city's accumulated filth and shame. Inside my little shop, the herbalist, the air was filled with the dry, bittersweet scent of herbs, a smell I found familiar and comforting. I sat behind the counter, methodically working an herb grinder. The stone wheel made a soft, rustling sound as it crushed the plants, like a quiet, meditative chant. Outside, the black Maybach remained silently parked, a massive beast stranded on a shallow bank, creating an absurd standoff with the dilapidated old alley. Raindrops splattered against its gleaming roof, kicking up tiny sprays of water. I knew the person inside was waging a war with himself. For a man like Caleb, pride was etched into his very bones, forcing him to drag his sick body out of the car, to walk into this shabby shop he would never normally spare a second glance, to beg for help from the ex-wife he had personally discarded. That was probably 1,000 times harder than admitting one of his projects had failed. The minutes ticked by. The rustling of the grinder and the patter of the rain intertwined. Finally, the back passenger door clicked open from the inside. A pale, slender hand emerged first, gripping the doorframe so tightly the veins on the back of it stood out, trembling slightly. Then, a tall figure struggled to get out. It was Caleb. He was leaning almost all of his weight on the car door and on Davis. The suit that was once impeccably tailored now hung loosely on his noticeably thinner frame, looking empty. His face was an unhealthy ashen gray. His hair was slicked to his forehead with rain, and his lips were chapped and colorless. He laboriously lifted his head, his gaze cutting through the rain to my small, warmly lit shop. In that instant, I clearly saw the complex emotions swirling in his eyes: disbelieving shock, bone-deep humiliation, the panic of a man on the brink of collapse, and a trace of utter bewilderment at being so cruelly toyed with by fate. He probably never dreamed that the miracle-working Mr. Thorne his assistant had told him about was actually his ex-wife, Clara Thorne, the woman who had done little more than arrange flowers and make soup, the woman he'd treated as a decorative piece for his home. Davis, holding a massive black umbrella, practically carried him as they stumbled across the threshold. A gust of damp, cold air mixed with the lingering scent of expensive cologne invaded the warm, herb-scented space. I stopped grinding but didn't get up. I just lifted my eyes slightly, my gaze landing on them with placid indifference. As if they were just two ordinary patients who had arrived a little late. Miss Thorne, Davis's voice was breathless, but mostly just awkward. Caleb's lips moved, as if he wanted to say something, but a violent coughing fit seized him. He bent over, coughing so hard it seemed to tear him apart. His shoulders trembled violently, as if he were trying to expel his own organs. The sound was terrifyingly hollow. Davis frantically patted his back, his face a mask of anxiety. I watched quietly, waiting for the fit to subside. Soon, the shop was filled with nothing but his ragged, painful gasps for air. "Sit," I finally said. My voice was low and flat, without a hint of emotion, as I pointed to the old wooden chair across from my desk. Davis quickly helped him over. Caleb's body was still trembling slightly. He tried to straighten his spine, to maintain his last shred of dignity, but it was clear the illness had drained most of his strength. He looked at me, his eyes filled with suspicion and scrutiny, but mostly with the desperate struggle of a cornered animal. You're Mr. Thorne?" His voice was painfully hoarse, each word sounding like it was scraped across sandpaper. "The one and only," I said, picking up a clean, soft cloth and slowly wiping the herb dust from my hands. "Mr. Sterling, I can see you. But my assistant should have told you my terms, right?" His Adam's apple bobbed. He didn't speak, just stared at me, as if trying to find any sign of deception on my face. "First, my consultation fee is $20,000 per visit," I said, my tone as casual as if I were quoting the price of groceries. "Cash or instant transfer. No credit." Davis sucked in a sharp breath. Caleb's brow twitched. "Second, how I treat you and what medicines I use are not up for discussion. You just do as you're told." Third, I paused, my gaze finally landing squarely on his eyes, which were filled with resentment and humiliation. "If you trust me, I'll treat you. If you don't, the door is right there. Don't let it hit you on the way out." The air grew thick. Even the sound of the rain seemed to fade. I could hear his suppressed breathing, getting heavier and heavier. $20,000 was a drop in the bucket for a man like Caleb Sterling. But I knew that this fee was like a resounding slap in the face, hitting him right where his identity as ex-husband and benefactor resided. He wasn't here for charity, he was here to beg for his life, and I was the one setting the price. He was silent for a full 30 seconds. In that half a minute, he probably weighed every ounce of pride he had accumulated in his 30 years against his primal instinct to survive. Finally, he closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were filled with nothing but a suppressed, gray defeat. He gave Davis a barely perceptible nod. Davis immediately understood, took out his phone, and tapped a few times. A few seconds later, my phone chimed with a clear notification. "Ding, direct deposit received, $20,000. The sound was exceptionally crisp in the quiet shop, almost echoing with a hint of mockery. I nodded, then finally stood up and walked behind my consultation desk. I placed a pulse pillow on the desk and gestured for him to put his wrist on it. His fingers were cold, trembling slightly as they rested on the pillow. The moment our skin touched, I felt him tense almost imperceptibly. I kept my eyes downcast, feeling the pulse beneath my fingertips, chaotic, weak, like a flickering candle in the wind. It was deep, slow, and sluggish. Blockages in key meridian points felt like dead knots. His vital energy was dangerously depleted, yet a false fire was rampaging through his system with no rhyme or reason. This pulse was dire. It was, indeed, the beginning of a living death. I looked up, glanced at his tongue. It was coated in a thick yellow film. "Mr. Sterling," I said, withdrawing my hand. My tone was as flat as a weather report. "It's no surprise the hospital couldn't find anything wrong with you. This isn't a physical illness. It's a collapse of your fortune, a disintegration of your vital energy. Your internal systems are knotted, and your body's balance is in chaos. To put it bluntly, your good luck has run out. The backlash has arrived, and it's hollowing you out from the inside." As I calmly explained, his face grew even paler, and a true deep-seated fear crept into his eyes. When he heard such mystical things from the master he revered, he treated it as gospel. Now, hearing it from me, the ex-wife he'd never even bothered to look at, it became the sharpest blade piercing his reality. Can it be treated? He asked, his voice dry, laced with a humility he didn't even notice. It can, I answered curtly. But it won't be easy. It depends on your cooperation. How do I cooperate? He asked, almost desperate. I took a notepad from the desk, scribbled a string of herbs and dosages with a flourish, and tore the page off, pushing it toward him. First, get these herbs. Brew them with 3 bowls of water down to 1. Drink it 3 times a day for 7 days straight. No meat, no sex, no anger, and you must be asleep by 11 p.m. every night. My demands were strict. He picked up the prescription and his brow furrowed. These herbs. What? I raised an eyebrow. Don't trust me, Mr. Sterling? If you want to back out now, I can refund half your money. He instantly fell silent. His fingers tightened, crumpling the flimsy piece of paper. A refund? That would be admitting he was wrong. It would be extinguishing his last glimmer of hope. He couldn't. He wouldn't dare. I'll take the medicine as prescribed, he said, practically gritting his teeth. Good. I stood up, making it clear he was being dismissed. Come back for a follow-up in 7 days. And remember, if you break any of these rules, you'll face the consequences. Davis quickly helped him to his feet. Caleb gave me one last, deep look, an expression too complex to decipher, before letting Davis guide him, step by agonizing step, out of my shop and back into the cold, driving rain. I walked to the door and watched the Maybach slowly pull away, its taillights smearing 2 blurry red streaks on the wet ground. The air still seemed to carry the scent of his despair and humiliation. I gently closed the door, shutting the whole farce outside. Turning back to the counter, I idly scrolled to the $20,000 transaction record. There was no sense of triumph, no joy of revenge. Just a cold, placid calm. Caleb, what you owe me is so much more than a mere $20,000. You owe me 5 years of my heart. You owe me justice. And this is just the first interest payment. In the grinder on the desk, the herbs had been crushed into a fine powder, releasing an even stronger, more bitter aroma. I pinched a little and brought it to my nose. Bitter, but with a sweet aftertaste. Just like the flavor some people were about to experience. The medicine was brutally bitter. The dark brown liquid, served in a coarse porcelain bowl, gave off a smell so intense it was nauseating. Just the scent alone made the back of his tongue clench. Caleb Sterling sat in his spacious, luxurious, yet soullessly cold bedroom, staring at the bowl of life-saving medicine, his brow knotted in disgust. He had never touched anything so crude in his life. In his world, treatment meant imported wonder drugs, sterile syringes, and the hushed tones of top-tier specialists, not this dubious, witch-like brew concocted by his ex-wife. But he had no choice. Ever since he'd returned from the herbalist and forced down the first bowl of bitter medicine as she'd instructed, the cough that had felt like it was tearing him apart had actually subsided. Though his body was still weak and he still woke up drenched in a cold sweat at night, at least the suffocating feeling that had clung to him, the feeling that he was about to draw his last breath, had eased. The medicine was working. That realization was a sharp thorn digging into his crumbling pride, even more difficult to swallow than the medicine itself. She actually knew medicine? The woman who had been by his side for 5 years. A woman who had been little more than a quiet, obedient, and barely noticeable presence, Clara? He pinched his nose, tilted his head back, and downed the cold liquid in one gulp. An indescribable bitterness instantly flooded his mouth and shot up into his sinuses, nearly making him choke. He frantically gulched down half a glass of warm water to fight back the urge to vomit. His stomach felt a little warmer, but his heart felt even emptier. He waved his hand, dismissing Davis, who stood by with the empty bowl, his face etched with concern. Now he was alone in the room. Beyond the massive windows, the city lights sparkled, once a symbol of his power, now they only illuminated his pathetic solitude. Silence washed over him like a tide. Clara's calm, almost mocking face uncontrollably surfaced in his mind again. The way she had looked at him. Gone was the timid devotion of the past. All that remained was an all-seeing indifference, as if his struggles and his humiliation were nothing but a clumsy performance in her eyes. Why? If she truly had these skills, why had she never shown them in the past 5 years? Why was she content to be a silent backdrop in his life? A backdrop he had so easily discarded. Sophia has the crimson birthmark on her wrist now. Is that what he had said? So confident, so matter-of-fact, as if it were indisputable proof. The crimson birthmark. Caleb's fingertips tapped unconsciously on the table. A vague doubt, like a pebble dropped into a calm lake, suddenly sent ripples spreading outwards. He remembered it clearly. When he had found Sophia and confirmed the destined birthmark, in his elation, there had been a fleeting, almost ignored sense of something being off. The mark, wasn't the color a bit too fresh? As if it had just appeared, or had been recently applied? At the time, he was so blinded by the joy of finding his true soulmate that he had instantly dismissed the thought. But now, combined with Clara's completely transformed medical abilities and her verdict of his collapsing fortune, a more terrifying thought shot through his mind. What the old mystic had started to say before he died. This woman is your. What was the rest? He shot to his feet. A wave of dizziness forced him to brace himself against the cold glass of the window. The reflection showed his pale, frantic face. What if Clara was the one? No. Impossible. He immediately rejected the absurd idea. The master's prophecy couldn't be wrong. The mark on Sophia's wrist was right there. But the hole of doubt in his heart was tearing wider and wider. He took a deep breath, swallowing the metallic taste in his throat, and grabbed the phone from his nightstand. His fingers trembled from weakness and an inexplicable fear. He dialed Davis's number. I want you to investigate something. He rasped, his voice carrying an urgency he didn't even recognize in himself. 5 years ago, at that monastery, besides the master who died, who else was there? I want to know about every disciple, every apprentice who was close to him. Don't miss a single one. And he paused, his voice turning grim. Do a thorough background check on Sophia. From 3 months before she returned to the country until now. All her movements, everyone she met. Especially find out if she had any contact with mystics, psychics, or tattoo artists. Davis was clearly stunned on the other end of the line. After a moment he answered hesitantly, Yes, Mr. Sterling. After hanging up, Caleb collapsed back onto the sofa, his chest heaving. He didn't know why he was doing this. Maybe he just wanted to prove his decision was right, to prove that everything with Clara was just a coincidence, a game of smoke and mirrors. But a powerful sense of unease, like a cold vine, was silently wrapping itself around his heart, squeezing tighter and tighter. He suddenly remembered the day of the divorce. The look Clara gave him after she signed the papers. It was calm. You could even call it pitying. At the time, he thought it was just his imagination, the false bravado of a loser. Looking back now, her eyes had clearly held a glint of someone who already knew how it would all end. A glint of mockery. Caleb, from now on we're even. That's what she had said. Even? How could they possibly be even? If this was all a mistake from the very beginning, if he had personally pushed away, then what were the last 5 years? What was his current suffering and humiliation? Was it all just one big, pathetic joke? Outside, the high beams of a passing car swept across the room. The blinding white light momentarily illuminated his bloodless face, and the cracks of fear and regret that were rapidly spreading across it. Once those cracks appeared, they could never be fixed. What he didn't know was that while he was desperately searching for the truth, across town, Sophia was admiring herself in an ornate, diamond-encrusted mirror. She gently touched the red dot on her wrist, her eyes filled with the triumphant glow of victory and a subtle, well-hidden anxiety. She had just received a call from someone she hadn't spoken to in a long time. The person's voice was greedy and vulgar, a reminder that it was time to pay up for her silence again. She impatiently brushed them off, hung up, and reapplied a layer of bright red lipstick. Caleb was already hers. No one was going to ruin what she had worked so hard to achieve. Especially not that woman who had already been swept out the door, Clara Thorne. The night was still young. The fragments of the truth were quietly assembling in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to form the sharpest of blades and slice through every carefully woven illusion. By the 5th day of taking the medicine, Caleb could walk on his own. Though his complexion was still far from healthy, the bone-deep weakness and feeling of impending death were definitely receding. The medicine Clara prescribed was like a dull blade, slow, but effective, pulling him back from the brink. This realization made the doubt in his heart grow into a towering tree, its gnarled branches stabbing at his last vestiges of denial. Davis's investigation had also borne fruit. The results were shocking. 5 years ago, the old mystic did indeed have a good-for-nothing distant grandnephew, lazy, greedy, and lecherous. And a month before Sophia returned to the country, a sum of money had mysteriously appeared in this man's bank account. It was a transfer from overseas, not huge, but enough to make him see green. After tracing it through several shell companies, the source of the funds was a close friend of Sophia's. And coincidentally, this grandnephew had dabbled in tattooing in his youth. All the pieces, at that moment, were strung together by a single thread called conspiracy. Crash! The glass in Caleb's hand fell onto the carpet with a dull thud, soaking a small patch of expensive wool. He didn't even notice. He just stared at the tablet Davis had handed him, his eyes glued to the dense screen of financial records and investigation notes. His fingers were ice cold, but all the blood rushed to his head, making his ears ring. It wasn't a mistake. It was a colossal, absurd, and ridiculous mistake, one that made him look like a complete and utter fool. He remembered how he had mocked Clara because of this shoddy scam, how he had thrown the divorce papers in her face, how he had declared with absolute certainty that she was just an imposter keeping someone else's seat warm. Arg! A low, guttural roar, like that of a dying animal, tore from his throat. He raised his hand and slammed his fist down on the mahogany table. The back of his hand instantly swelled, a sharp pain shooting through it, but it was nothing compared to the agony of being ripped apart and trampled from within. Sophia. He grabbed his car keys and charged out of the house like a fully enraged lion, his eyes bloodshot. He didn't even bother with a coat, wearing only a thin dress shirt as he plunged into the cold night air. The roar of the engine shattered the tranquility of the neighborhood. He tore through the streets, only one thought in his mind: find Sophia and get the truth. He didn't even know if he was seeking confirmation, or just needed to vent the rage and shame that threatened to burn him alive. The car screeched to a halt in front of Sophia's apartment building. He stormed upstairs and pounded on her door. When the door opened, Sophia, dressed in a silk robe with a facial mask still on, beamed at the sight of him. Her smile quickly vanished, replaced by terror at his savage expression. Caleb? What are you? Before she could finish, Caleb seized her wrist, his grip so tight it felt like it would shatter her bones. Ow! That hurts. What are you doing? Sophia cried out in pain. The mask fell off, revealing her panicked face. This mark. Caleb's voice was terrifyingly hoarse, like sandpaper on wood. How did you get it? Tell me. Sophia's face went white, her eyes darting around. What are you talking about? It's natural, of course. Bullshit. Caleb dragged her across the living room to the floor-length mirror, pressing her wrist hard against the cold glass. Natural? Sophia, who do you think you're kidding? Do you want me to get an expert to authenticate it right now? To see if this is a birthmark or if it was goddamn tattooed on. His fury and his blazing eyes completely shattered Sophia's composure. She started struggling and crying. Let me go. Caleb, you're hurting me. So what if it is? I just wanted to be with you again. What did I do wrong? What right does that Clara Thorne have? What right? Caleb shoved her away as if she were a piece of filth, watching as she stumbled and fell onto the carpet. He glared down at her, his eyes colder and more disgusted than she had ever seen. She has the right because when I was dying, she could save me. And you? What can you do besides pull these cheap, underhanded tricks to deceive me? Sprawled on the floor, her hair a mess and her makeup ruined, Sophia heard his words and snapped her head up. Her face, first shocked, twisted into an expression of extreme resentment. She saved you? Ha ha ha, Caleb. Do you still think she's some kind of saint? Do you have any idea why she married you? She was just trying to. Her words stopped abruptly as she realized what she'd said, clapping a hand over her mouth. But it was too late. Caleb's pupils constricted. He lunged forward and grabbed her again. Tell me, why did she marry me? I don't know. I don't know anything. Sophia was in a full-blown panic, shaking her head and avoiding his gaze. Just then, the apartment door was pushed open gently from the outside. A slender figure leaned against the doorframe, holding a reusable grocery bag filled with a few fresh herbs. It was Clara. She seemed to have been just passing by, or perhaps she had heard the commotion. Her expression was calm, so calm it was almost indifferent. She looked at the chaotic scene as if she were watching a bad play that had nothing to do with her. Her gaze swept coolly over the pathetic Sophia before finally settling on the crazed Caleb. It seems Mr. Sterling has found what he was looking for, she said, her voice quiet but carrying clearly to everyone in the room, tinged with a knowing sarcasm. Caleb whipped his head around to look at her, his bloodshot eyes a maelstrom of conflicting emotions, guilt, shame, anger, and a faint flicker of pleading. But Clara seemed not to see it. Her eyes fell on Sophia, who was trying to crawl away unnoticed, and a faint, cold smile touched her lips. "Ms. Miller," she said slowly, taking her phone out of her bag and tapping the screen. "The part you didn't finish, were you about to say that I married Caleb because his grandfather owed my master his life, and my school sent me to repay that debt and settle the karma? Is that right?" A clear audio recording played from the phone. It was the argument between Sophia and Caleb, including her unfinished accusation. Sophia froze completely, her face ashen. Caleb looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. He stared at Clara, then back at Sophia and staggered. Repaying a debt? Karma? So even their 5-year marriage wasn't what he thought. It wasn't her trying to get something from him? Clara put her phone away, her tone as casual as if she were discussing the weather. "You seem to know all the details, Ms. Miller. That must be because when you paid off that mystic's apprentice, you also dug up all the Sterling family's old secrets, right? Thinking you might be able to use them as leverage later?" The truth, like an ice-coated dagger, was driven home by Clara in the calmest way possible. Every carefully woven lie, every false mask, was torn to shreds, laid bare under the light, ugly and nauseating. Caleb stood there, looking from the limp form of Sophia on the floor to the cool, detached Clara in the doorway, who looked as if she might ascend into the heavens at any moment. He suddenly felt the world spin. The belief that had sustained him for 5 years, the fate he thought was his, and all the choices and pain he had caused because of it, it was all a scam. A ridiculous scam built on greed and lies. And he was the biggest fool of all, the one who had been played the hardest and hurt others the most. Thump! With a muffled sound, Caleb Sterling fell to his knees. Not from weakness, but from total and utter collapse. Caleb knelt there. It wasn't weakness. It was a complete shattering, a collapse that started in his very bones. The knees of his expensive trousers were stained with who knows what from Sophia's carpet, but he didn't notice. He stared up at Clara, who stood silhouetted against the light in the doorway. His eyes were so red they looked like they might start bleeding, and his lips trembled, but he couldn't force out a single word. Apologize? Repent? In the face of such a raw, absurd truth, any words would be pathetically pale, tragically weightless. Sophia lay in a heap nearby, a puddle of tears and smeared makeup, all her usual elegance gone. Clara's gaze swept over the wreckage with the same detached calm, as if watching the end of a play that had nothing to do with her. There was no victorious glee on her face, no flicker of pity, only a complete, untethered indifference. She didn't look at Caleb again, nor did she acknowledge Sophia. She just picked up her bag, turned, and walked toward the elevator. Her figure was thin, but her back was ramrod straight, like a stalk of bamboo that had rerooted itself after a storm. "Clara!" Caleb's voice was a raw, broken cry, as if he'd finally woken from a nightmare. He scrambled to get up, trying to chase after her, but his weakness and the immense shock made him stumble and fall back to one knee. He reached out toward the closing elevator doors, his fingers spasming, but he caught nothing but a handful of dusty air from the hallway. The elevator doors slid shut, cutting her off from his sight, cutting him off from all the unspoken words and desperate hopes. 3 months later, the old sign for the herbalist on the south side street was still there, but the line of people waiting outside was noticeably longer. There were old neighbors and strangers who had come after hearing of her reputation. Clara still wore her simple cotton dresses, sitting behind her desk, calmly checking pulses and writing prescriptions. Sunlight streamed through the clean windows, casting a warm, golden glow on her focused profile. She had gained a little weight since the divorce, and her cheeks had a healthy blush. The quiet confidence that radiated from within gave her a kind of indescribable brilliance. Dr. Thorne, thank you so much. My mother took 3 doses of your medicine, and she's finally sleeping through the night. A middle-aged man said gratefully as he went to fill his prescription. Clara just gave a slight nod and called the next number. Life was as calm as a deep pool of water. The storms of the outside world seemed unable to touch this small, quiet space. Occasionally, she would hear snippets of news. Sterling Corp had undergone a major corporate shakeup. Several executives who had been with Caleb for years were moved from their core positions, supposedly after some shady accounting was discovered. Sophia's family business had run into serious trouble, its funding cut off, with rumors that Sterling Corp had a hand in it. She herself seemed to have vanished from their social circle entirely. Some said she'd gone abroad, others whispered she'd had a breakdown and was in hiding. And Caleb's illness, they said, was mostly better, but he had become unusually silent and gloomy. He spent most of his time at the office, a veritable workaholic. A few times, a neighbor would tell her conspiratorially that they had seen a fancy black car parked at the end of the alley for hours at a time. But no one ever got out. Clara would listen, offer a quiet hum, and continue grinding her herbs, as if hearing a story about someone else's life. We're even now, she had said, and she meant it. One evening after closing up, she locked the shop door and was about to head back to her small apartment when she saw a familiar, yet distant, figure standing under the old locust tree at the end of the alley. It was Caleb. He was wearing a simple dark coat. He was thinner, but he still carried the air of a man used to being in charge, though it was now shrouded in a deep exhaustion and loneliness. He just stood there, quietly watching her shop, his eyes a tangled mess of regret, pain, and a humble plea, mixed with a fear that kept him from getting closer. When he saw Clara emerge, he flinched almost imperceptibly. His throat moved as he seemed to summon all his courage to slowly walk toward her. They stood a few feet apart. The late autumn wind blew through the alley, carrying a chill. Are you, he began, his voice still a bit hoarse, doing okay? Clara looked at him, her gaze perfectly calm. I'm doing very well. You don't need to worry, Mr. Sterling. The formal address was like a fine needle, pricking him gently. A flash of pain crossed his face. I transferred more money to your account. The rest of the settlement from the divorce. And for the treatments, he said, his words jumbled. I know you don't need it, but I owe you. You don't owe me anything, Clara cut him off, her tone still flat. The transaction is complete. The karma is settled. Mr. Sterling, we've been even for a long time. Even? Caleb repeated the word, and the last flicker of light in his eyes died out. He looked at her as if trying to burn her image into his memory. Clara, I know it's too late to say anything now, but I truly am sorry. The long overdue apology hung in the air, light and meaningless, failing to cause a single ripple. Clara turned slightly, preparing to leave. The prophecy, Caleb suddenly asked, a desperate last-ditch effort in his voice. What was the rest of it? The part the master never finished. If I left you, would I have really died? This was the last thorn in his heart, the source of all his fear. Clara paused but didn't turn back. As night fell, the street lamp at the end of the alley flickered on, casting a soft halo around her. She was silent for a few seconds, then spoke in a voice that was almost merciful, yet utterly cold. Caleb, the master's prophecy was that my fate carries a solitary star. To you, I was a calamity, not a blessing. Marrying me allowed you to borrow the residual grace of my school, granting you 5 years of superficial success, but in reality, you were constantly overdrawing your own foundational luck. It was like drinking poison to quench a thirst. And leaving me. She finally turned her head slightly. The dim, yellow light cast shadows on her face, making her expression hard to read, but her eyes were startlingly clear, and just as startlingly cold. Was not a swift death. It was the inevitable result of a destroyed foundation. Your fortune would collapse, you'd be plagued by illness, and for the rest of your long life, you would suffer a living death. She paused as if delivering a final verdict. So you won't die. You'll live, and you will get to savor the bitter fruit that you planted with your own 2 hands. Without another word, She turned and walked into the warm lights of the alley's deeper end. Her back was resolute, without a trace of longing. Caleb froze, as if his soul had been ripped from his body. A living death. So that was the full prophecy. It wasn't that leaving his destined soulmate would kill him. It was that after leaving his true calamity, he would face a slow, irreversible ruin. All his beliefs, all his choices, had been wrong from the very beginning, and wrong in a way from which there was no recovery. The cold wind swirled the fallen leaves at his feet. He stared down the alley where she had disappeared, at the warm glow of the lantern outside the herbalist, and for the first time, he understood with absolute clarity. The only light in his life, the one medicine that could have saved him, he had pushed away with his own hands, and now she was lost to him forever. How would he face the rest of his long life? This prophecy of a living death. He didn't know. He only knew that from this moment on, every night would be unbearably long, and the name Clara Thorne would no longer be about love or hate. It would be a scar carved into his fate, a curse like crack that would never heal.